They gonna kill me, y'all. I'm gonna make them kill me, y'all. Today is the day I die. Today is the day I die, y'all.
Today is the day I die.
April 2024. Columbus, Georgia, a quiet city in the American South where families wake each morning expecting nothing more than the ordinary. But in one home, what began as a normal day for a young mother and her children turned into something that would shock the nation. Her name was Asia Allen. She was just 26 years old, a devoted mother of two, a woman who friends described as warm, protective, and determined to build a better life for her children. For her, those children were everything. They were her future, her hope, and her reason to endure every hardship. But on that day, everything she had built was ripped away in an act of violence carried out by a man she once trusted. His name was Antavius Brown. 28 years old, a former partner who could not accept the end of their relationship. What followed was not just a murder, but a moment that forced an entire community to watch horror unfold in real time. Because after killing Asia inside her home, in front of her terrified children, Brown did something that stunned even seasoned investigators. He reached for his phone, he opened Facebook, and he went live. For thousands of people scrolling through their feeds, what appeared at first like just another live stream became something they would never forget. Brown spoke to the world directly, just moments after pulling the trigger. He justified his actions. He explained himself. And then, as police closed in, he took viewers with him on a frantic chase through the streets of Columbus. This was not a crime kept in the shadows. It was broadcast for all to see. It blurred the line between private tragedy and public spectacle, forcing strangers, family members, and law enforcement to confront violence in its rawest form as it happened. What drove a young man to kill the mother of his children in front of them? Why did he feel the need to share his final moments with the world? And how did this act of violence leave behind wounds far deeper than the ones seen on that terrible day? In this episode, we will retrace the story of Asia Allen and Antavius Brown. We will examine the events that led up to that April morning, the confrontation inside her home, the chilling live stream that followed, and the police pursuit that ended in another death. This is not only the story of a murder, it is the story of children left behind, a community shattered, and a disturbing reminder of how technology has given crime a new stage. If you appreciate carefully told true crime stories that shed light on both the tragedy and its lasting consequences, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Because tonight, we begin with the final moments of a young mother's life and the shocking decision that made the world a witness. To understand the tragedy of April 2024, we must begin with the lives at the center of it. Asia Allen was more than just another victim in the headlines. She was a daughter, a friend, and above all, a mother. Those who knew her described her as loving and resilient. She carried the weight of responsibility at a young age, raising two children who depended on her for everything. Every choice she made was anchored to their well-being. Family members often said she lived with one goal in mind: to provide stability, love, and a future her children could look forward to. Her life was not one of wealth or luxury, but one marked by dedication, long hours, and selflessness. In the city of Columbus, Georgia, she was known as a young woman with promise, but also as someone who had endured her share of struggles. Like many young mothers, she navigated the challenges of balancing personal relationships with the demands of parenting. It was within this balance that she once shared a relationship with Antavius Brown. Brown was 28 years old. On the surface, he was like many young men in the area, active on social media, surrounded by peers and searching for purpose. But behind that surface, there were patterns that would later prove devastating. Accounts from those close to the pair suggest that the relationship between Asia and Antavius had become strained long before April. Arguments, tension, and the difficulties of separation created a fracture that could not be repaired. For Asia, moving on meant safety, and a chance to raise her children without conflict. For Brown, however, letting go appeared to be impossible. The city of Columbus itself is a place where community and history intersect. With military roots, family neighborhoods, and a strong sense of Southern identity, it is a place where news travels fast and tragedies weigh heavily on its people. Domestic violence cases had long been a concern for local authorities, but few could imagine the scale of horror that would soon play out. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Brown's behavior raised alarms among those who knew him. Friends later recounted his mood swings, his anger, and his refusal to accept that his relationship with Asia was over. The tension between them had become dangerous, and yet, as with so many cases of domestic violence, the full danger was only recognized when it was already too late. On the morning of the crime, Asia began her day as she often did, caring for her children, providing them with the sense of normalcy she fought hard to protect. But in the shadows of that routine, Brown was making his own plans. Plans that would not only end a life, but change the lives of two young children forever. The stage was set, not by chance but by a history of conflict and an inability to let go. Asia's determination to build a better life for her children stood in stark contrast to Brown's growing rage. And in April 2024, that collision of love and violence would erupt into something that could never be undone. April 2024. The morning began like countless others for Asia Allen. Inside her home in Columbus, Georgia, her two children were with her, children who trusted her to provide them with safety and care. For them, it was just another day. For Asia, it was a continuation of the life she had worked tirelessly to build, a life of sacrifice, protection, and devotion. But outside those walls, Antavius Brown was already on his way. The 28-year-old ex-boyfriend, consumed by anger and unable to release his hold on a broken relationship, carried with him a weapon that would forever alter the course of lives. What should have been an ordinary day for a mother and her children was about to turn into a nightmare. When Brown arrived, the confrontation did not begin quietly. Witnesses would later recall the sounds of raised voices, the sharpness of argument cutting through the air. Inside the home, Asia stood firm, defending herself and her children against the verbal storm hurled in her direction. This was not the first time she had faced his anger, but it would be the last. In front of her children, two young lives too innocent to understand the depth of the danger, Brown escalated. Words turned into threats, threats turned into violence. And then, with chilling resolve, he reached for the gun he had brought with him. Shots rang out inside the home, rapid, merciless. Asia Allen was struck multiple times. Her children, frozen in terror, could do nothing but watch as the most important person in their world collapsed before their eyes. The screams, the chaos, the sound of gunfire, it all unfolded within the small space of their family home, transforming it into a scene of devastation. Neighbors would later describe hearing the commotion. Some rushed to call authorities, others stood in disbelief, uncertain of what had just shattered the peace of their neighborhood. But for Asia, there was no chance of survival. Her life ended there, in the place she had tried so hard to protect, with her children as the unwilling witnesses to her final moments. The aftermath inside that home was a silence more haunting than the noise that preceded it. Two children left without their mother, a community left to ask how anger could have replaced love with such finality. And Antavius Brown, standing over the irreversible consequences of his actions, made a choice that set this case apart from so many others. He did not flee quietly. He did not surrender. Instead, he reached for his phone. With blood still fresh on his hands and chaos behind him, he opened Facebook. With the press of a button, he took his private act of violence and placed it in the public eye. In the minutes that followed, thousands would tune in, not realizing that what they were about to see was not entertainment, but the unraveling of a life already lost and a man descending into his final chapter. With the gunshots still echoing in his mind, Antavius Brown walked out of Asia Allen's home, leaving behind two children in shock and a community about to be shaken to its core. But instead of disappearing into the shadows, instead of fleeing in silence, he did something almost unimaginable. He reached for his phone. On Facebook, with one swipe and one press of a button, he began a live stream. At first, those who stumbled upon it may have thought it was just another video. A man talking into his camera, his face hard, his voice heavy. But within seconds it became clear that what they were watching was not entertainment. It was confession. It was justification. It was the unraveling of a man who had just taken a life. Brown spoke directly to the world, addressing not just friends or acquaintances, but thousands of strangers who would soon tune in. He explained what he had done, laying out his anger, his frustration, his twisted reasoning. There was no remorse in his words. There was only rage and a sense that if he could not control the narrative of his life, he would at least control how the world saw its ending. As the live stream continued, police across Columbus were already mobilizing. Reports of gunfire had reached dispatch. Neighbors had called in frantic voices. Officers knew the suspect was armed and dangerous, but now they also knew exactly where he was. Because Antavius was showing them. He was showing everyone. Inside his vehicle, camera-propped, Brown drove with reckless speed through the streets. Viewers watched in real time as he swerved, as red lights blurred past, as he ignored traffic and put countless other lives at risk. Sirens wailed behind him, patrol cars chasing, but for those watching online, the perspective was chillingly intimate. They were inside the car with him, witnesses to his thoughts, his expressions, his unraveling. Some who tuned in begged him in the comments to stop. Others cursed him for what he had done. Many watched in stunned silence, unsure if they were seeing something real or staged. But it was real. Every mile, every second, every breath was live. The chase stretched across the city. Police worked frantically to contain him, trying to predict his next move as the live stream provided a window into his mind. And then, without warning, the inevitable happened. Brown lost control. His car careened off the road. Metal crumpled, glass shattered, and the vehicle came to a violent stop. For officers rushing to the scene, it was the moment to end it, to bring him into custody, to prevent further loss of life. But Antavius Brown had no intention of facing a courtroom. As the police closed in, as lights and commands surrounded him, he raised the gun once more. And on camera, in front of the same audience that had watched his escape, he pulled the trigger. The live stream went dark. In a matter of hours, 2 lives were gone. 1 mother, 1 father. 2 children left in the aftermath, and a community left haunted by the knowledge that the world had been forced to watch it unfold in real time. When the live stream ended in silence, the shockwave spread instantly. For the thousands who had witnessed it online, there was confusion, disbelief, and horror. For law enforcement in Columbus, Georgia, there was urgency. 2 lives were already lost, and 2 children had been left behind in unimaginable circumstances. Now came the task of piecing together every detail of what had happened. At Asia Allen's home, the crime scene was secured. Officers entered a house that hours earlier had been filled with the ordinary sounds of family life. What they found instead were the unmistakable signs of violence. The children, traumatized and unable to process what they had just seen, were quickly placed under protective care. Investigators walked carefully through each room, cataloging bullet casings, marking the points of impact, and collecting fragments of a story written in gunfire. Every photograph taken, every piece of evidence bagged, was a step toward preserving the truth of what had unfolded. Neighbors gathered outside, their voices hushed, their faces carrying the weight of disbelief. Some had heard the shots, others had seen the chaos that followed. Many had already learned through social media what had transpired inside the house next door. The sense of shock was amplified by the speed with which the crime spread across both the neighborhood and the internet. At the site of Brown's crash, another team of investigators faced a different scene. His vehicle sat mangled and still, surrounded by flashing lights. Officers carefully approached, confirming what the live stream had already shown. Brown was dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Inside the car were personal belongings, the firearm used, and his phone, still broadcasting just moments before impact. Forensic experts collected everything, aware that the device itself contained not only digital evidence, but also the disturbing record of his final actions. The investigation required connecting two separate locations, two linked tragedies. Detectives reviewed Brown's social media accounts, examining the live stream in detail. They studied his words, his expressions, the timestamps, and the comments flooding in from viewers. They gathered witness testimonies from those who had seen the chase unfold on the streets of Columbus. Every fragment added to the timeline of a crime that had been both intensely private and terrifyingly public. Meanwhile, attention turned to the children. Social workers and family members stepped in, recognizing that their trauma could not be measured by evidence alone. They had seen what no child should ever see. For investigators, their role was not just to record facts, but to ensure these children would be shielded as much as possible from the relentless media coverage that followed. By the time the evidence was compiled, the conclusion was undeniable. Antavius Brown had murdered Asia Allen in front of her children, fled the scene, broadcast his thoughts and actions to the world, and taken his own life before he could be captured. The case, in legal terms, ended with him. But for the community, for the families, and for the children left behind, the investigation was only the beginning of years of unanswered questions. When the livestream ended in silence, the shockwave spread instantly. For the thousands who had witnessed it online, there was confusion, disbelief, and horror. For law enforcement in Columbus, Georgia, there was urgency. 2 lives were already lost, and 2 children had been left behind in unimaginable circumstances. Now came the task of piecing together every detail of what had happened. At Asia Allen's home, the crime scene was secured. Officers entered a house that hours earlier had been filled with the ordinary sounds of family life. What they found instead were the unmistakable signs of violence. The children, traumatized and unable to process what they had just seen, were quickly placed under protective care. Investigators walked carefully through each room, cataloging bullet casings, marking the points of impact, and collecting fragments of a story written in gunfire. Every photograph taken, every piece of evidence bagged, was a step toward preserving the truth of what had unfolded. Neighbors gathered outside, their voices hushed, their faces carrying the weight of disbelief. Some had heard the shots, others had seen the chaos that followed. Many had already learned through social media what had transpired inside the house next door. The sense of shock was amplified by the speed with which the crime spread across both the neighborhood and the internet. At the site of Brown's crash, another team of investigators faced a different scene. His vehicle sat mangled and still, surrounded by flashing lights. Officers carefully approached, confirming what the live stream had already shown. Brown was dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Inside the car were personal belongings, the firearm used, and his phone, still broadcasting just moments before impact. Forensic experts collected everything, aware that the device itself contained not only digital evidence, but also the disturbing record of his final actions. The investigation required connecting 2 separate locations, 2 linked tragedies. Detectives reviewed Brown's social media accounts, examining the livestream in detail. They studied his words, his expressions, the timestamps, and the comments flooding in from viewers. They gathered witness testimonies from those who had seen the chase unfold on the streets of Columbus. Every fragment added to the timeline of a crime that had been both intensely private and terrifyingly public. Meanwhile, attention turned to the children. Social workers and family members stepped in, recognizing that their trauma could not be measured by evidence alone. They had seen what no child should ever see. For investigators, their role was not just to record facts, but to ensure these children would be shielded as much as possible from the relentless media coverage that followed. By the time the evidence was compiled, the conclusion was undeniable. Antavius Brown had murdered Asia Allen in front of her children, fled the scene, broadcast his thoughts and actions to the world, and taken his own life before he could be captured. The case, in legal terms, ended with him. But for the community, for the families, and for the children left behind, the investigation was only the beginning of years of unanswered questions. With the investigation concluded and the suspect dead, there would be no trial. There would be no courtroom where witnesses could testify, no cross-examinations, and no sentencing that might bring a sense of closure. The case of Asia Allen and Antavius Brown ended not with a verdict, but with silence. A silence that forced the community to face difficult questions. For law enforcement, the absence of a trial meant their work was largely administrative. The evidence they had gathered, the bullet casings, the forensic records, the digital footprint of Brown's livestream, would never be presented before a jury. Instead, it was documented, sealed, and stored, not for prosecution, but for history. Officers who had pursued Brown in those final hours spoke of the frustration of chasing a man who never intended to be captured alive. For them, it felt like a race against time that had been lost the moment he turned the gun on himself. For Asia's family, the lack of a trial was a double-edged reality. On one hand, they would be spared the painful process of reliving her murder in court. On the other, they would be denied the chance to see Brown held accountable in a legal setting. There would be no judge to declare him guilty, no official sentence to mark the magnitude of his crime. Instead, they were left with the fact that he had chosen his own end, leaving them without answers and without justice. The children became the heart of the community's concern. Local organizations and advocates rallied to provide support, raising funds and offering counseling. Community vigils were held in Asia's memory, candles lit in the night sky as friends and strangers alike spoke her name. At those gatherings, the conversation turned quickly from grief to urgency. How many other women lived in fear behind closed doors? How many children were at risk of seeing violence erupt in their own homes? The role of technology also came under scrutiny. Brown's decision to live stream his escape and confession forced uncomfortable questions onto the public stage. Could Facebook have shut down the broadcast more quickly? Should platforms be equipped to immediately detect and halt violent content? Lawmakers and experts debated these issues as the video, though removed, continued to circulate online in fragments shared by those who had recorded it. The permanence of digital media meant that the tragedy could never truly be contained. In Columbus, community leaders urged residents to see the case as more than an isolated act of violence. They spoke of it as a call to confront domestic abuse head-on, to offer resources to victims before situations reached the point of no return. Churches, shelters, and advocacy groups joined together, not only to honor Asia's life, but to prevent the next tragedy. In the end, the legal system had no sentence to deliver. The justice that remained was social, carried by the voices of a grieving family, a traumatized community, and a nation unsettled by the sight of violence streamed in real time. What remained was not closure, but a collective reckoning. With domestic violence, with technology, and with the reality that some crimes live on far beyond the moment they are committed. In the wake of the tragedy, the city of Columbus found itself grappling with more than just grief. It was left with questions that could never be fully answered. With Antavius Brown dead and Asia Allen gone, the story ended abruptly, but the echoes of what happened continued to ripple outward. People wanted to understand why. They wanted to know what had pushed Brown to the point of no return, and whether anything at all, could have stopped the violent path he chose. One theory centered on control. Those closest to Asia said Brown had always struggled with anger and jealousy. Friends recounted small warning signs, moments where his temper flared in ways that made her uneasy. The murder, they believed, was not a sudden snap, but the culmination of years of possessiveness. In their eyes, the livestream was not just a confession, it was his last desperate attempt to control the narrative, to show the world his pain on his own terms before taking himself out of the picture. Others believed it was shame. Brown's words on Facebook carried tones of regret, almost like a man realizing the weight of what he had done in real time. His decision to end his life, some argued, may not have been about control at all, but about fear. Fear of facing the legal system, fear of the backlash, and fear of living the rest of his days branded as a murderer. To those who saw it this way, Brown's suicide was the coward's way out, avoiding accountability, leaving Asia's family to pick up the pieces. Still, a third theory emerged from those who watched the case unfold online. They argued that the very act of broadcasting his actions may have altered his mental state. By speaking to an audience, Brown wasn't just confessing, he was performing. The line between reality and spectacle blurred, and as millions of people learned of the crime through digital whispers, Brown may have felt trapped in the role he had written for himself. Once the performance began, there was no way to step back. For Asia's family, theories didn't matter as much as the reality that she was gone. Her children would never again feel the warmth of her embrace, never hear her laugh in the living room, never share the small, ordinary moments that make a family whole. They were left with memories and trauma. Therapists who later worked with families in similar cases warned that children who witness or are touched by domestic violence carry scars that last well into adulthood. For the community, the aftermath became a lesson in vigilance. Teachers, pastors, neighbors, they all began to ask themselves if there were warning signs they had missed. Could anyone have intervened before it was too late? The uncomfortable truth was that many families live with shadows like these, often hidden behind closed doors until tragedy bursts through. And yet, amidst the pain, there was also resilience. Asia's name became a rallying cry, invoked in campaigns against domestic violence and in conversations about how social media handles live broadcasts of trauma. The story was retold not just as a crime, but as a warning, a reminder that unchecked violence, left to fester, can consume both victim and perpetrator, leaving behind a silence louder than any words. In the end, the theories could never rewrite what had happened. The aftermath was not about answers, but about learning, remembering, and ensuring that Asia Allen's story would not vanish into the digital void. Her life and her loss became part of a much larger conversation, one that the city and the country could not afford to ignore. In the quiet that followed the tragedy, the city of Columbus was left with a chilling silence. Streets that once echoed with the noise of everyday life now carried whispers of a crime that had unfolded in real time, both in a home and on a digital stage. The murder-suicide of Asia Allen and Antavius Brown wasn't just another case filed away in police records. It was a turning point that forced the community and the world to confront unsettling questions. The reflection began with the victims left behind, Asia's children. Their lives, once anchored by the presence of a loving mother, were now thrown into chaos. For them, healing was not just about processing grief, but about learning to navigate a world where the word family had been shattered. Counselors who stepped in knew that the journey would be lifelong. Each milestone, birthdays, graduations, weddings, would carry the shadow of absence, the reminder of what had been stolen. For Asia's family, grief was mixed with anger. They wanted justice, yet justice was denied to them the moment Antavius pulled the trigger on himself. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no chance to look him in the eye and demand answers. That absence of accountability left wounds that could not easily heal. In interviews, family members spoke not just of pain, but of frustration. Frustration that he got to dictate the end of the story while they were left to carry its burden. On a wider scale, the case became a haunting reminder of the thin line between private violence and public spectacle. Social media, designed as a tool for connection, had been twisted into a stage for confession and finality. It was impossible to ignore the irony. A platform meant to bring people closer had, in this moment, broadcast the destruction of a family to countless strangers. Activists and policymakers began to debate. Should live streams be more tightly monitored? Should platforms have stronger safeguards to detect crises in real time? Some argued that if the system had intervened, perhaps by alerting authorities faster, a life could have been saved. Others countered that technology alone could not prevent violence rooted in control, jealousy, and human behavior. Still, one undeniable outcome was awareness. Domestic violence shelters in Columbus reported an increase in calls after Asia's story broke. Women who had stayed silent began to speak out, fearing that if they didn't, they too might become headlines. The tragedy became both a warning and a spark, pushing conversations into spaces where silence once reigned. And for the community, the reflection was sobering. Friends, neighbors, and strangers alike realized how often signs of danger are ignored or minimized. They began to ask harder questions. How do we protect those we love? How do we create systems where victims feel safe enough to leave before violence escalates? In the end, the legacy of Asia Allen's story is not one of despair alone. It is also one of remembrance, caution, and the determination to prevent history from repeating itself. Though her life was cut short, her story continues to resonate, urging society to see, to listen, and to act. Her name, whispered in vigils, carried in conversations and written in articles, remains a reminder that behind every statistic is a human being, and behind every tragedy is a chance to change.